The day I walked into that boardroom, I never imagined I'd destroy a $1 billion empire. They said I was just a nobody from nowhere. But when he looked at me across that conference table, something shifted. Little did I know, I was about to become the most dangerous person in his world. Listen, I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew about yourself gets turned upside down. Moments when you realize that the person you've been trying to become might not be who you're meant to be at all. This is one of those stories. Before we dive in, do me a favor. If you've ever felt like an outsider, if you've ever had your heart broken by circumstances beyond your control, hit that like button. Let me know I'm not alone in this. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that dig deep into the messy, complicated reality of human connection, then subscribe. Because I promise you, stories like this don't come around often. And once you hear how this ends, you'll understand why some truths are worth fighting for, even when the whole world tells you to walk away. I grew up in a town where everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew I was the girl who worked 3 jobs just to pay for community college. My mom cleaned houses, my dad fixed cars when he could find work, and I spent most of my teenage years believing that people like me just didn't get the fairy tale ending. We got by, and that was supposed to be enough. But something inside me refused to settle for just getting by. I studied until my eyes burned, saved every dollar I could, and somehow managed to transfer to a real university. The day I graduated, I looked around that ceremony and realized I was probably the only person there who had to choose between buying groceries and buying textbooks. That feeling of being different, of being the outsider, it followed me everywhere. When I got the call from Henderson and Associates, I thought it was a mistake. A consulting firm that worked with Fortune 500 companies wanted to hire me. The girl who grew up in a trailer park and wore the same 3 outfits to every job interview. I said yes before they could change their minds, packed everything I owned into my beat-up Honda, and drove to the city with exactly $200 in my checking account. Walking into that glass building on my first day, I felt like I was entering a different world. Everyone moved with this quiet confidence, spoke in acronyms I didn't understand, and carried themselves like they belonged there. Their clothes probably cost more than my rent. I spent the first week convinced someone would figure out I was a fraud and send me back where I came from. Then they assigned me to the Sterling Industries project. I'd never heard of them, but apparently, they were old money. The kind of family that had been rich for so long they forgot what it felt like to worry about anything. The kind of people who made decisions that affected thousands of lives without thinking twice about it. I was supposed to help modernize their operations, which felt like the ultimate irony. Me, someone who still used a flip phone, helping $1 billion company catch up with the 21st century. I had no idea that walking into that conference room would change everything, that the heir to that empire would look at me like I was the most interesting person in the room, instead of the most out of place. The first time I saw James Sterling, he was sitting at the head of a mahogany table that probably cost more than my car. Everything about him screamed privilege, the perfectly tailored suit, the way he held his coffee cup like he'd never had to make his own, the casual authority in his voice when he spoke. I expected him to look right through me, the way rich people usually do with service workers and junior employees. But he didn't. When our eyes met across that conference room, something shifted. He actually listened when I spoke, asked questions about my ideas instead of dismissing them. Most surprising of all, he stayed after everyone else left to talk about the project. Not to hit on me, not to put me in my place, but because he seemed genuinely interested in my perspective. Working late became our routine, while everyone else went home to their expensive apartments and weekend plans. We'd order takeout and spread reports across the conference table. That's when I started seeing glimpses of the real James, not the heir to a fortune, but a man who questioned everything he'd been taught about how business should work. He'd grown up in boardrooms but had never actually worked a day in his life. I'd grown up working but had never seen the inside of a world where decisions were made with millions of dollars on the line. The strangest part was how easy it became to talk to him. He told me about the weight of expectations, how every choice he made was scrutinized by his father, the board, the media, how he'd never had a real relationship because everyone either wanted something from him or was chosen for him. I told him about working midnight shifts at a gas station to pay for textbooks, about the shame of using food stamps, about the constant fear that someone would figure out I didn't belong. One night, after we'd been working for 3 months, he looked at me and said something that changed everything. "You know, you're the first person who sees me as just James, not as James Sterling." The way he said it, with this mixture of relief and sadness, made my heart skip. That's when I realized I wasn't just falling for the idea of him. I was falling for the man he was when nobody else was watching. But falling for James Sterling was like reaching for something beautiful behind glass the moment you got close enough to touch it. Reality shattered everything. I found out about Victoria Blackwood the same way I found out about most things in his world, by accident, overhearing a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. She wasn't just his girlfriend, she was his fiancée, had been for 2 years. Their engagement was more than a relationship, it was a business merger disguised as love. The Blackwood family owned half the shipping industry on the East Coast. Their marriage would create an empire worth billions, secured both families' legacies for generations. Victoria was everything I wasn't: old money, finishing school education, the kind of woman who knew which fork to use at dinner parties I'd never be invited to. She was perfect for him, at least on paper. When I confronted James about it, I saw something break in his eyes. He told me he'd been trying to find a way out of the engagement since the day we met, but it wasn't that simple. His father had built Sterling Industries from nothing, and now everything depended on this merger. The company was going public, stock prices were volatile, and one wrong move could destroy thousands of jobs. "I never wanted this," he said, and I believed him. But wanting and having are two different things when you're born into a world where your personal life belongs to shareholders. That's when Charles Sterling called me into his office. I'd never been alone with James's father before, and the man who sat across from that massive desk wasn't the polished businessman I'd seen in meetings. He was a predator who'd built an empire by knowing exactly where to apply pressure. He offered me money, more money than I'd ever seen in my life, to disappear. "You're a threat to everything we've built," he said, like I was some kind of natural disaster instead of a person who'd fallen in love with his son. I looked at this man who could buy and sell my entire hometown without thinking twice, and I realized something that surprised even me. I wasn't afraid of him. I was angry. Angry that he thought I could be bought. Angry that he saw me as a problem to be solved instead of a human being. "Your money can't buy what your son and I have," I told him, but deep down, I was starting to understand that maybe it didn't have to. Sometimes love means walking away from the person who makes you feel most alive. That's what I learned the day I realized that staying in James's world would destroy everything he'd ever known. The media had gotten hold of our story somehow. Photos of us leaving the office together. Speculation about the mysterious woman who'd captured the Sterling heir's heart. Stock prices dropped. The board called emergency meetings, and Victoria's family threatened to pull out of the merger entirely. I watched James torn between two impossible choices: his family's legacy and his own happiness. He chose me. He called off the engagement, stood up to his father, and told the world that he was in love with someone who didn't fit their perfect picture. For exactly 3 days, I let myself believe that love could conquer everything, that we could build something real together, even if it meant starting over. But then I saw the damage, really saw it. Thousands of Sterling Industries employees facing layoffs because the stock price had crashed. Victoria, humiliated in front of everyone she'd ever known. James's father, watching his life's work crumble because his son had chosen love over duty. I realized that Charles Sterling had been right about one thing. I was a threat to everything they'd built, not because I was a bad person, but because I represented a choice that their world couldn't afford. The hardest conversation I've ever had was telling James goodbye. We met one last time at the coffee shop where we'd had our first real conversation, away from the conference rooms and corporate pressure. He looked at me like he was memorizing my face, and said the words that still break my heart: "You're the only thing that ever felt real." I wanted to tell him that he was real to me too, that what we had was worth fighting for. Instead, I kissed him goodbye and walked away. 6 months later, I was working at a small marketing firm in another city, trying to rebuild my life, piece by piece. I thought I'd made peace with my choice until the day James walked into my new coffee shop. He looked different, lighter somehow, like he'd finally figured out who he was without the weight of expectations. "I stepped down from the company," he said simply. "I'm starting something new, something that's actually mine." We talked for hours about second chances and what it means to choose your own path. Maybe some love stories don't end with riding off into the sunset. Maybe they begin with two people brave enough to start over. You know what I learned from all of this? Sometimes the scariest thing you can do is be exactly who you are in a world that wants you to be someone else. When Charles Sterling called me a threat to his legacy, he thought he was insulting me. But looking back, I think it was the greatest compliment I've ever received. Because the only things worth threatening are the systems that keep people small, the expectations that crush dreams, and the walls that separate us from our own truth. James and I, we're still figuring it out. We're building something new together, something that doesn't fit anyone else's definition of success. Some days are harder than others. Some days we wonder if we made the right choice. But every morning when I wake up and look at the life we're creating, imperfect, uncertain, but completely honest, I know we did. If my story touched something in you, if you've ever felt like you didn't belong but refused to give up on your dreams, then I want you to know you're not alone. Hit that like button not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been told they're too much, too little, or too different. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that love, real love, is worth the risk. That sometimes being called a threat means you're changing things that desperately need changing. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about real people making impossible choices, about love that doesn't fit in neat boxes, about finding your own path even when the whole world tells you to stay in line, then subscribe. Because the truth is, we all have moments when we have to choose between what's safe and what's real, and sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is choose to be authentic in a world that profits from your conformity. The next time someone calls you a threat, ask yourself, what are you threatening? If it's someone's comfort with inequality, their investment in keeping you small, or their belief that some people don't deserve extraordinary love, then maybe being a threat is exactly what the world needs. Maybe you're not the problem. Maybe you're the solution they've been too afraid to see.